I have a very long-standing love for the prayer that Emily just took us through. Many of us call it the Atonement Prayer. Today, we're calling it the Accepting the Atonement Prayer. I first saw it in the 90s in Absence from Felicity, which is Ken Wapnick's biography of Helen Schuckman. And I just prayed it countless times once I discovered it. When we conceived the idea of creating the CE, that's one of the things I looked forward to having in there. And now that it is in there, many of you have fallen in love with it as well. And even though we just heard it from Emily, I just want to go ahead and read it to you now. And I'm going to go ahead and change the language to you and yours just because I prefer that language. I think the King James language was a bit more natural to our ear in the 60s. I would like to pray that my will be united with yours. And this is a prayer we say to Jesus. Recognizing that your perfect love will suffice or correct for my imperfect love. I pray that I may accept the atonement with conviction, recognizing its inestimable worth and my own divine worth as part of this identification with yours. I pray that my fear be replaced by an active sense of your love and your continual willingness to help me overcome the split or divided will, which is responsible for my difficulty with this. I accept the divinity of the messages I have received, and that was a reference to the Course. And affirm my will in both accepting and acting upon the atonement principle. Here I am. Now, even if you do love this prayer, you may not know it was given specifically to Bill Thetford. Helen, in her notes, labeled it as special message directly to William Thetford, and it was designed specifically to answer his issues on this path. Now, along these lines, I recently made a discovery that was quite exciting to me. It turns out that just 3 days before this prayer came through, Helen asked for a special note about Bill. Okay. And the note she received talks about the very condition in Bill that the prayer is designed to answer. So here is that note. We have some a little photo of Helen's handwritten notes on the top of the slide there. So Helen said, I asked here for a special note for Bill. And here's the special note. Tell Bill his delaying tactics are holding him back. He does not really understand detachment, distantiation, and withdrawal. He is interpreting them as holding himself aloof from the atonement. So first, just to clarify, distantiation is the act of keeping something at a distance, either emotionally or intellectually. So what's Jesus's point here? He's just taught us a few sections before this that we can use all three of these, detachment, distantiation, and withdrawal, to distance ourselves from error, from illusions. But he says Bill's doing the opposite of that. He's using them to hold himself aloof from the atonement. And this is a delaying tactic that's holding Bill back. Okay. Now, I want to talk briefly about that word atonement because many of us stumble over it. And so it can help us to use a shorthand for the word atonement. Atonement in the Course is often associated with the word return, the return to God. So when we hear atonement, we can mentally think the return to God. So Bill was holding himself aloof from the return to God. Also, at one point, the Course says atonement means correction or the undoing of errors. So Bill was holding himself aloof from correction, from the undoing of his errors. At another point, the Course speaks of the atonement principle and says the principle was love. So Bill was holding himself aloof from love. And you can wrap all those together and say he was holding himself aloof from this path. And as I said, and we'll look at more closely later, that's exactly the condition the prayer is designed to answer. So we're going to actually add a footnote into the next printing of the CE and just point this out because it really brings even more life to the prayer. And that condition of holding himself aloof from this path is, as Emily said, a condition that to some degree we share. Surely we can relate to holding ourselves aloof from the Course in different forms. And it turns out that this is a running theme in Jesus's comments about Bill. At one point, he says, quote, Bill regards himself as too weak to accept the Course. And don't we tend to feel like we're just too weak to really fully accept the Course? Jesus also says, Bill acts as if he does not understand the Course, implying that he does understand it, but prefers to act as if he doesn't. And might that not fit us too? Don't we say we don't understand it when maybe somewhere deep inside, perhaps we do? And here is how Jesus describes Bill's reaction to being reminded that he's been promised a surprising function in God's plan. Okay, Jesus has been talking about this, and Helen had reminded him of it. So Jesus says, I was amused when you reminded Bill that he too, like Helen, was being prepared for something quite unexpected, a function just as surprising as Helen's. And he said he was not at all curious about what it was. This disinterest is very characteristic of him when he is afraid. Interest and fear do not go together. So Bill acts like he's just not interested when he's actually afraid. Okay. And don't we exhibit curious, maybe even amusing disinterest about major promises the Course has made to us, perhaps even promises about our special function? And couldn't that disinterest really be a sign of fear? So Bill's story in this regard has tremendous relevance for us. What I want to do today is go through three passages in particular about Bill in this respect. One is about Bill's will. Another is about his habit of disengagement and disinterest, which we've talked about a bit already. And the third is the accepting the atonement prayer itself. So first, let's talk about his will. Bill, it turns out, like a lot of us, had tremendous ambivalence about his will. Yet Jesus said he needed it for this journey. And I think this strikes at a major issue on this path. As Course students, as spiritual students, we tend to see our will as just a negative, right? We shouldn't strive. That's efforting, we sometimes say. The spiritual solution is always to release, to allow, to surrender, to turn it over, to let go, to do nothing, to simply abide. And it's true, Jesus values those things, but he also says we need the strength of our will in this process. So I want to look at guidance that Helen received, and it's the focus of Cameo 22 in the back of the CE. It's called The Return of His Will. And the guidance begins with Helen asking why Bill is feeling depressed. And interestingly, we actually know he was depressed at this exact time. So 3 days before the guidance was received, he wrote about his depression in his journal. So here's what he said. He said, great difficulty in getting up out of bed, feeling of generalized fatigue, etc., as a continuation of previous depression. And here's what Helen took down. So she asked, why is William Thetford more depressed than usual? And what Jesus says is not super long. It's pretty short, but it's packed with meaning. So I'll go ahead and read it to you and then try to unpack it especially for our purposes today. Jesus's answer is, he is in a very deep sleep and much more resistant to waking than you are. Isn't that interesting? The major problem with him is that his is a passive resistance, which implies a giving over of will. Like it's not his will, he's not actually resisting. This always induces a state of resignation and therefore depression. Tell him that no one can resign, referring to the resignation, from the sonship, since membership is not optional. He has been looking for someone to take his will away because he thought it was the cause of his trouble. Since the Course has placed such consistent emphasis on will, and since he agrees with the emphasis, his past adjustment is threatened. And I'll try to make that clear in a sec. That is why he could not sleep. His past came to, quote, haunt him because he is giving up the belief in ghosts. Tell him again not to be afraid of ghosts and remind him that he has no past. The return of his will is what he wants. No one can accept it but himself. So what's he saying here? Jesus is saying that Bill is resistant to waking, but it's a passive resistance. The word passive means lacking in will. When you're passive, all the power seems to be outside of you. Okay? So it's not that you are resisting awakening, it's that awakening is just objectively impossible. And Jesus says this leads to resignation, which, according to the dictionary, is a sad feeling of accepting something that you do not like because you cannot easily change it. So his awakening is just out of his power, out of his reach, and he can't change that. And that resignation leads to depression. Basically, Bill has given over his will. He's wanted to get rid of it. Why? Jesus says he thought it was the problem. And apparently, getting into the language about ghosts in the past, apparently his will had done bad things in the past. That's why there are the references to the ghosts of the past coming back to haunt him. The ghosts appear to be things his will had done that he regrets. So he thought if he just unplugged his will, took it offline, that would keep those ghosts quiet. But now the Course is playing what Jesus calls such consistent emphasis on will. And Bill agrees. So now those ghosts of the past, the regrettable things his will has done, they're stirring to life, and now he can't sleep. But Jesus concludes by saying he need not be afraid of ghosts, and he has no past. And then he says that key line, the return of his will is what he wants. Now, could this be our situation as well, at least to some degree? We might have a strong will in normal life, but even if we do, could we have unplugged our will when it comes to our spiritual journey? Are we engaging in a passive resistance where we're secretly resisting awakening, but we're telling ourselves, hey, it's just outside of my control. Reaching the goal is just impossible. Okay, it's out of my reach. Have we resigned ourselves to the idea that we just can't get there? Like Bill, have we tried to give our will away? And do we need to go in the opposite direction? Could it be that the return of our will is what we want? And I'll say that for myself, I fully relate to Bill's condition. When I was in my grade school years, 10, 11, 12, I really decided that my will was destructive. I had an aggressive, competitive will, and I just decided I got to unplug that thing. And so basically became a fairly passive person in life. So I can totally relate to Bill. Anyway, this all brings up a big question. What does it look like to bring our will back online on the spiritual journey? What does that look like? And that brings us to the next passage, which is very powerful. So, speaking to Bill, Jesus first says this. He says, your lack of vitality is due to your former marked effort at solving your needless depression and anxiety through disinterest. Because your ego was protected by this unfortunate negative attitude, you are afraid to abandon it. So here's his disinterest again. And what's being said? Bill thought that if he felt depressed or anxious, he could solve it by just being disinterested, by essentially saying, I'm indifferent. I don't care. I'm not invested. But the problem is, if you say, I'm indifferent, I don't care enough, what happens? All your vitality drains out. And that's what's happened to Bill. What then is the solution? And the solution is in a long passage, which comes right after this, but it so captures what Jesus wants from us that I just had to include all of it. Okay. So notice how opposite what Jesus says here is to Bill's stance of disinterest and feeling drained and fatigued and lacking vitality. So here's what he says. Speaking to Bill, when you have exerted real efforts to give up this voluntary dispiriting, so he's been voluntarily dispiriting himself through his disinterest, you have already seen how your mind can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. But you are not sufficiently vigilant against the demand of your ego that you disengage yourself. So his ego is saying, disengage, just be disinterested, and you'll have a form of peace. Okay. And Jesus is saying, no, be vigilant against your ego's demand to do that. And then emphatically, he says, this need not be. The new habit of engaging with God and his creations is easily made if you refuse actively to let your mind slip away into disinterest. Your problem is not concentration. It is a belief that nobody, including yourself, is worth consistent effort. And you can see all the consistent effort that Jesus is talking about in this passage. When you've exerted real efforts, your mind can focus, actively refuse. All of that's consistent effort. So then he says, side with me consistently against this deception that he's not worth the effort of concentrating. As you have sided against it briefly already, do not permit this shabby belief to pull you back. Again, that's the belief that Bill isn't worth the effort. The disheartened are useless to themselves and to me, but only the ego can be disheartened. And then in a couple lines later, he says, your mind and mine can unite in shining your ego away and releasing the strength and beauty of God into everything you think and will and do. Notice all the will in that line, right? Releasing the strength of God into everything you think and will and do. Do not settle for anything less than this and refuse to accept anything but this as your goal. That is the solution to Bill unplugging his will. It's an astonishing passage. It shows what a fully engaged will can do on this path. So think about this in relation to yourself. Okay? Even if you aren't exactly like Bill, do you lack vitality? Do you feel disheartened and dispirited, including on this path? And are you tempted to find a cool pseudo peace through disinterest? Then, according to this passage, and you might want to just imagine yourself doing all this as I read it to you. Be vigilant against your ego's demand that you disengage. You don't need to give into that. As Jesus says, this need not be. Actively refuse to let your mind slip away into disinterest. Exert real effort to give up this voluntary draining of your vitality. And then you will see how your mind can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. Now, it may seem impossible to have this kind of concentration, but that's not the real problem. The reason you can't concentrate is your belief that you simply aren't worth the effort, the consistent effort, which is just another form of your resignation. But Jesus knows you are worth consistent effort. And he asks you to side with him consistently against your belief that you aren't, and to not permit that shabby belief to pull you back. Because your mind and his can unite in shining your ego away, releasing the strength of God into everything you think and will and do. Do not settle for anything less than this and refuse to accept anything but this as your goal. Can you feel all the strength of will in all of that? Look at those emphatic lines. Exert real effort. Actively refuse to let your mind slip away. Do not permit this shabby belief to pull you back. Do not settle for anything less. Refuse to accept anything but this. That's the kind of will we need on this journey. And that's the will that I think most of us, to some degree, have thrown away in all of our focus on surrendering and allowing and turning over, etc. Okay, so number 3, now let's go back to the accepting the atonement prayer. If you know a little about Bill, which we know more now, you can see that every single line in this prayer is masterfully designed to address some aspect of Bill holding himself aloof from the atonement. Okay, each line, in other words, contains a solution. And sometimes the problem that it's a solution to is overtly mentioned. But even when it's not, we can kind of reverse engineer the solution to figure out what the problem is. And so that's what I've done in a table that we're going to show you. The table is a list with the implied problem on the left, and then on the right is basically a quote from the prayer. I fiddled with the language a little bit, taking out the thy and thine, for instance. But hopefully with each one, you can see if you relate to Bill's problem And if you do, that means Jesus' solution is really tailor-made for you. Okay. So, first, Bill's problem is his will feels separate from Jesus' will. Does your will feel separate from Jesus' will? Solution then is to pray that to Jesus, that my will be united with yours. Does perfect love seem just out of your reach? Solution is to pray, I recognize that your perfect love will suffice or correct for my imperfect love. And in the actual prayer, those first two things are connected. So when you unite with his will, you tap into his perfect love, which then becomes yours. Do you feel like you're having trouble really accepting the atonement? The solution? To say, I pray that I may accept the atonement with conviction, recognizing its inestimable worth. It's good to add conviction into there, to add that strength of will. Do you feel lacking in worth? Something that Jesus addressed with Bill several times. The solution? To say to Jesus, I recognize my own divine worth as part of this identification with yours. Do you feel fear? I mean, everyone does. The solution to say, I pray that my fear be replaced by an active sense of your love. Do we merely believe theoretically that we have Jesus's love, or do we have an active sense of his love? Does your will feel divided? Right? Part of your will is going in the direction of God, part of your will is going in the direction of the ego, which of course causes difficulty with the course. That ambivalent will, that divided will, is the source of our difficulty with the course. The solution? To pray for an active sense of Jesus's continual willingness to help us overcome our divided will. If you feel ambivalent, you can pray to get in touch with his attempts to help you with that divided will. Like Bill, do you doubt the course's teachings? Well, let's face it, we all do. The course says a lot of extreme things. If we didn't doubt those things, we would be there. We'd be raising the dead. The solution? To say, I accept the divinity of the messages in this course. It's okay just to put your will behind that acceptance. Do you feel like your will is unable to embrace the atonement principle? Then the solution is to say, I affirm my will in both accepting and acting upon behaviorally the atonement principle. And finally, Jesus often addressed this thing in Bill where he wasn't entirely sure he was here, like in existence. And he therefore felt distance from Jesus and distance from this path. And I think the solution to all that, the solution that Jesus gave Bill a few times, was to simply say, here I am. I'm present, I'm in existence, I'm present to Jesus. And in this case, I'm present on this path. So what you can see is that every single thing in the prayer is designed as a solution to Bill holding himself aloof from this path. And so the prayer is one of the solutions to our own condition of holding ourselves aloof from this path. One of our solutions can be to pray and affirm our will, to pray and reach out to Jesus and unite with his help. His will can strengthen our will. His love can become our love. So I think you can see Bill's problems are ours. Like Bill, it feels to us like awakening is just objectively impossible. we simply feel too weak to really accept the course. Our will isn't strong enough, or so we think, to accept the atonement. Perfect love is just out of our reach. And we feel sadly resigned to this fact. But in truth, we are secretly in a state of resistance, a passive resistance. We have unplugged our will on this path. We've made it all about letting go and allowing, when we also need the strength of our will to power our journey. Like Bill, we are often disheartened and dispirited, drained of vitality. Our ego has told us if we just disengage and act indifferent, we can find a kind of peace. And we have listened. We need to go the other way. As Jesus says, the return of our will is what we want. We can say no to our ego's demand to withdraw into disinterest. We can focus and rise above fatigue and heal. We can, in the words of the prayer, affirm our will in accepting and acting upon the atonement principle. We can affirm that we have the strength to accept the course. We can refuse to accept anything less than complete salvation. And we can reach out to Jesus, knowing that joining with him can release the strength of God into everything we think and will and do. As I was reflecting on this, I realized the problem here with Bill and with us is always some form of backing away, isn't it? Standing back in resignation and disinterest, being in a passive resistance, holding ourselves aloof from this path, from Jesus, from love. It's always some form of kind of backing away, standing off. So the question is, this is a personal question for each of us. What would it look like to reverse all that? What would it mean for you to be fully engaged with this path? What would it mean to bring your will fully online on this journey? And that apparently is what Bill eventually did. Okay. As many of you know, after he retired, he went to California and completely devoted himself to walking this path. And so when people said to him, "What do you do? Like, what's your job?" His answer was forgiveness. He devoted himself full time to forgiveness as his job. So if Bill could finally get over holding himself aloof from the atonement, perhaps we can too. Thank you.